So thanks all for coming. Today we have Vaishnav, Sundara, Rajan, who will talk to us about market entry. And Vash completed his MBA in 2014 and has been working as a management consultant at Deloitte ever since. And prior to that, he was a biomedical and systems engineer. And over to you, Vash, and take it away.
Sure. No worries. Pleasure to meet everyone. My name is Vash. My actual name is far too long and complicated, so completely understand if no one can pronounce it. I've basically been with Deloitte since 2015. As Ali already mentioned, finished my MBA 2014. The very typical background, technical. So engineer, worked as an engineer for a number of years, and wanted to essentially move out of being in a purely technical role into something else. So two things really helped me in that journey. One was obviously the MBA from Melbourne Business School. Taught me a lot of theoretical concepts I definitely had not come across as an engineer. But the second thing that really helped me continue that academic journey and make it a little bit more practical in the real world was management consulting. So I've been with Deloitte since 2015. Initially joined a team there called Strategy and Operations. That team was restructured about 2 years ago and essentially split into two parts. So effectively splitting apart the strategy and the operation side. The strategy side was effectively, in Australia at least, renamed or rebranded as Monitor Deloitte, which you all might have come across. I basically am in the operations side, which has been renamed to Transformation and Operations, or TNO. In that time, in the last almost coming up to 6 years now, I've worked on a number of different clients, number of different locations around the world. So prior to March 2020, which is when the whole lockdown and COVID happened, I live in Melbourne, by the way. But prior to March 2020, I did on average about 40 weeks on the road every year. A lot of that was international as well. So I spent a year living in a mine site in Mongolia. Did a bunch of time in Serbia. Again, I do a lot of work in energy and resources, so mining was very much at the center of what I did. Pretty much most of the major big miners were my clients. And the type of work I did was basically ranged or varied quite a bit. So back when we were still strategy and operations, I did a little bit of strategy, but definitely a lot more ops improvement. So a lot of the stuff that you'd be familiar from your classes on operations management with Kanan, well, all of that stuff was things that I did in practice. So applying principles of Six Sigma, statistics, statistical process improvement. But a lot of it was also just, what we call change management and essentially helping organizations navigate change. It could be following a large-scale transformation. It could be, following a post-merger or as part of the post-merger integration operation and so on. So in the last year or so, because of COVID, I haven't been able to do any travel, so I haven't done any of that mining work. And most of my work now has been in capital projects, so which is essentially construction work. So I work with most of the major transport networks for which are essentially, in many cases, owned by the state governments across various states in Australia. So New South Wales, Victoria, and so on. So I work with a lot of these transport bodies on their large capital projects. So the work I do specifically involves looking at putting in place planning and structures and essentially planning the entire capital transformation. But also a lot of the work I've been doing more recently has been on implementing digital strategy in asset management. So essentially, using things like smart sensors to collect real-time data about your assets and then feeding that into a large algorithm or machine learning algorithm that then tells you in real time, advises your managers how to make decisions on what assets you need to be refreshing when and so on. This obviously has very large scale applications. I've done this in, as I said, capital projects, but I've also done this with people like the Department of Defense because they have a large number of mobile assets, mostly the Navy with their ships and all that. So that's essentially a summary of me. And I've been a member of Consulting Club back when I was a student. So very much been in your shoes right now. Except back then there was no COVID, so it was in an actual room, so we could see each other face to face. And I've also come back as a presenter a couple of times, forgotten how many, but a few times I've come back both face to face and I did this virtually last year as well. So that's about me. So with respect to market entry, the key thing here, so I'm going to sort of go through this very much with the case framework in mind, because this is obviously What you're looking at here is this is a type of a case that you will get in an interview among a very large number of different types of cases. And I know that this is sort of a part of a series of presentations that the consulting club does every year, like a dozen or so. So I know every week you've got different people coming to talk about different things. So with that sort of context in mind, with respect to, so I won't spend much time in terms of talking about approaching the case and all of that, because I'm fairly confident that the club already knows that. So I'll talk very specifically about what market entry style cases are like. As the term suggests, it's fairly simple, and you kind of know when you're in a market entry case, because it's almost always a decision of whether or not the company or the entity in question in that particular case has to. So the question can be in one of several types. The first could be very much what we call a binary option, which is a yes or no, which is they give you an option of, we are considering entering market X, or we're considering launching new product line, or we're considering expanding our operations here. Should we do it? And the answer to that is always a yes or a no, because they've kind of already set it up for you now. That's usually that's the first part. But depending on whether there is enough time and how you've gone as a candidate, there will definitely be follow-up. So if you say, regardless of whether you say yes or no, the interviewer will almost always ask you why or why not, and then there will be follow-up questions. This isn't an interviewee-led case. If it's an interviewer-led case, which as far as I know, I think only McKinsey does, in that case, what you might find is that the answer you give here will probably be part one of like a several part longer set of questions. So you can definitely guarantee that there will definitely be follow-up parts and more options being presented and so on and so forth. I've never done an interviewer-led case myself as a candidate or as an interviewer. I've always only done interviewee-led. That's what we do at Deloitte. So I just got a comment over here in the chat.
Yeah, sorry, Vash. I didn't have the market entry slide, so we might.
Okay, no worries. Look, it was only 2 slides, so I'll talk about it, and then I'll try and find the slides in my inbox, and then I'll send that across again. Apologies for that mess up, guys. I'll find the slide shortly. So I'll keep talking about it. So in terms of so what I talked about is effectively the what a market entry type question. So it can be, usually you'll get a binary option, but the other type of question you can also get will be one that I call is more creative exploration, where it could literally be as open-ended as here's the situation, and our objective is basically that we'd like to grow our revenues, or we'd like to grow profit, or we'd like to grow our presence in this area. What do you think we should do? Now that can be a little bit harder if you're not prepared for it, because it is fairly open-ended. So what I've done in the past when I've actually been given that type of a question is, the answer to anything in consulting, by the way, and to even cases, is to go back to the basics and come up with a logical framework or a structure. Now, if you've done that thinking beforehand, then it definitely makes your life easier, but you can do it on the spot. So in those kind of open-ended situations, what I've typically done is I've used a 2x2 framework. Again, I don't have the slide in front of me, so what I might do, and I don't think this has a whiteboard function, or does it? Probably not. I actually have a whiteboard in front of me, but I'll have to turn the camera around. That's all right. I'll just quickly, I'll talk through it, and then I'll sort of draw it up. But effectively what you've got here is a 2x2 situation. And essentially the easiest way to think about it is, on one axis, you've got your product or your service. And the other axis, you've actually got your customers. So if I just draw that up very quickly in my notebook over here, and what I'm going to say is, on the x-axis, which is my products or service, I've got what I call existing products or services. Now there is actually a name given to this framework. I just can't remember it among all the different economists who attach their names to different things, but I just remember the framework. So there's existing products, and then there's basically what we call new products or services. And then on the other hand, on the y-axis, what I would say is you've got your existing customers, and then you've essentially got what we call your new customers. Now, once you draw this framework out, the 4 sort of quadrants become fairly simple. Essentially, what I'm saying here is that, given your yeah, that's probably it. Ansoff matrix. Thank you. I've never heard of Ansoff, but clearly that's what it is. So yes, if you've already come across the Ansoff matrix, I don't have to explain it that much more to you. But really, something like this is actually not a bad starting point. I'm not saying this is going to give you the cookie cutter to the approach to the answer, but something like that, when you're dealt with a very open-ended question, is not a bad idea. And then what you can actually do in each of these is actually go through then and logically drive your line, put something like this out, like the answer matrix out. Of course, prior to putting the framework out, the first thing you do as part of any case is you get some information about the company in question, who they are, what their products are, what their services are. So you get comfortable with that. And then you put this out, and then you start to populate those quadrants with trying to understand what the various options are for, market entry or market expansion into a new segment or a new area. And then very quickly, some of these can actually be eliminated probably straight from the offset. And I'll talk now very quickly about the other part of the market entry situation that you might face. So something like this is essentially open-ended and gives you all the options. But now the other part, which is actually what I talked about the last two times I did when I talked about market entry, is essentially a bit more straightforward. This is the part of actually, once you've sort of identified the options, knocking out the options, eliminating and reducing down to something that's viable. If there is something that's viable, it could very well be that, the answer could very well be that it's actually not feasible at all to enter this market given our circumstances and situations. But I'll sort of go into the second part, which is actually on slide 2 of the slides, which again, I'll send through later. But the second part is actually, once you've actually got your options out, eliminating that down. And there's really 3 things that you should be looking at when you're eliminating this down. So the first one, which is the one that, everyone easily goes to, is profitability. It's easy. It's a well understood concept. So essentially, the entity needs to, or this venture, if you will, or this project basically needs to have a positive NPV, once over the long term, and it has to be fairly significantly positive. Like it has to be better than your BATNA, which is your next best option or whatever that is, enough to justify taking the risk. So that's the easy one, and literally any MBA student I've met can do a quick calculation around that and say, whether is this profitable or not. And I can talk a little bit more about that in detail once we actually jump into the cases today. The second part, and this is again one that some of the better candidates tend to consider, is essentially the feasibility of execution. Just because something is a positive NPV and it's a great idea, there's a question that is to be asked here as to whether or not we are the right team, or do we have the right capabilities to be able to execute this operation? Do we actually have experience at doing, this type of market entry before, whether it's, expanding, launching new products, whether it's new segments, new customer base, whatever it is, have we done this before? If it is basically entering a market through an option of acquiring an existing major player in that market, do we have experience doing M&A? Like, do we have experience doing post-merger integration? Is the goal from a corporate strategy perspective to keep this entity as a standalone child that essentially going to, for all intents and purposes, continue to operate the way it has, or is the goal to integrate them into the larger giant? Well, these are all questions that have to be considered, and depending on the answers to that, it can, even if the idea might have a positive NPV, if we can't genuinely execute it, then it doesn't mean it's a no, but it does mean that when you are giving the answer back to the interviewer, you have to point out these challenges and say, I would recommend that we offset these risks by doing X, Y, Z. That's what makes the difference between what I'd call like a good candidate and like an excellent candidate, someone who's going to get through to the next round, get the offer and so on. Now, there's a third factor that I actually ever considered until one of my friends, Terry Singley, I think he might have shown up on one of these other weeks of presentations. He used to work for McKinsey. He actually pointed it out, which is actually alignment. And it's not just strategic alignment, because that's an easy one again. Like, does this line up with our long-term vision? He talked more about what he called alignment to your values as an organization and ethics and all of that. Now, remember that the entity in these cases that you get could be any type of organization. It could be a for-profit entity, which is essentially straightforward. You've got shareholders, they care about returns and things like that. It could be a not-for-profit entity or a social enterprise, someone like an Oxfam or the like. It could be a startup. So it could be any one of the various types of organizations. But regardless of that, organizations typically have values and they do have a brand that they care about. So a good example might be that maybe this is a great profitable venture and we have the ability to execute it, but it involves working with and I'm just throwing an example out there. This is not my own political view of any sort, but I'm just throwing an example. But let's say that it involves, let's say that you're Nike and you've got an idea to expand your manufacturing into China, but it involves using, Uyghur workers. Well, you might want to have a think about, does that line up with your values or not as an organization, and how that reflects on your brand, something like that. Similar, and if you're a not-for-profit, that becomes a bit more front and center, because a lot of your revenues, a not-for-profit, might be coming from donations and the like. And so your brand very much, and the kind of standing you have in society will determine whether people want to donate to you or not. So those are the 3 pillars I typically would consider. Now, let's go a little bit one layer deeper into each of those and think about very quickly how you'd go about eliminating it. Now, at this point, you have your own options of how you want to do this. I've got a set of ways I've used in the past that have worked for me in an interview situation. Remember that in an interview, you don't have to give the most accurate answer. That's not the objective. You need to get an order of magnitude, and it needs to be fairly accurate with the numbers given, to the point that you can make an informed decision. It has to be about 70-80% correct, and that's good enough for the interview. What they're testing to see is whether or not you have the logical framework and you have the ability to execute on it. They know that once you actually get the job, you'll use Excel just like everyone else, and you'll have a lot better, you'll have financial statements and everything. So for the first part, which is the profitability, it's very simple. Calculate the NPV. Now, the easiest way to do this practically is to just look at the first year cash flows, or essentially cash flows into the business. So that's essentially your net profit for the first year. Add a certain factor for growth in the long-term growth of that market segment, whatever it might be. Just remember that, again, some common sense rules apply here, like your long-term growth cannot exceed the GDP growth rate of that country, because otherwise that company becomes bigger than the entire country. So don't, like in the short term, maybe you're growing, 30% year on year. That's not really a long-term, like in the long term, it'll always taper off to something that is a little bit more organic, whether it's the population growth rate, something else, so pick something like that, and typically pick a long-term, pick a simple long-term growth rate, pick a simple discount factor, like 10%, just because it's easy for you to do your calculations. Now, more likely than not, you never actually have to calculate the NPV in an interview. Once you calculate the first year's cash flows, you'll get an idea, are they, obviously you want them to be positive. If they're negative, that's not a deal breaker, because maybe the company is still in its sort of infancy, the project in its launch up, the launch stage, so they've had to recoup some huge costs. But if these costs have not basically been capitalized or as capital costs, then they may have to basically treat them as OPEX, and they have to recoup them. So maybe because of that, the first year profits are negative. But do look in the long term to see whether that situation is likely to change, particularly with growth of the market, the growth of your market share, whatever factors you want to consider. Now, as I said, you don't have to really calculate the NPV in most cases. You'll be able to get an idea based on a number plus a growth rate as to whether or not the answer to that first question is a yes, which is this likely to yield a positive NPV in the long term? The second two parts, which is the second one basically being, your ability to execute on it. Again, a simple framework you could use for that is, and I don't really have a name for this framework, it's just something that I would think about, is look at your evidence of past things you've done. So do you have competency? Do you have proven competencies in this area that you can leverage? Look at, and if you don't, if the answer to that is no, look at whether you can partner with someone else. Also think about a big factor around the second one is the type of, if it's going to be an acquisition, or something like that, it's a type of the way in which you're going to enter that market. So is it going to be a wholly owned acquisition? So essentially you're going to go in and just buy them out. Is it going to be a joint venture? Is it going to be some sort of licensing arrangement? There are many different options you can massage there to decide what that option number 2 is. And depending on what you go down, and again, this is a conversation with the interviewer. They might knock out some of those options for you straight away because that's not the preference of the company. Then that makes your life a little bit easier and lets you decide whether number 2 is a yes or a no. Now, even if number 2 is a no, does not mean the entire project is should be a no. So you then go on to number 3, and then you evaluate all the 3 pillars. So the third one, of course, is your alignment, your values. That one, actually, in my opinion, now that I'm saying it, make that your first one, actually, because it's the easiest one to eliminate, and it's completely qualitative. You just have to understand whether this is something the company would consider, and have they considered the impact on their brand. And it straight away shows your maturity as a candidate because you've considered the broader picture. So get that out of the way. Now, if all 3 are yes, then it's probably going to be a yes. If you've got like 2 no's and a yes, or 2 yeses and a no, then it entirely depends on which one is the no. If the no is the profitability one, then you're most likely going to go with a no, unless there's something you can think about there, either reducing your cost of capital, other ways to increase the cash flows and the profits. You have to think of something, a lever that you can pull within that NPV in order to make that positive. And if there's no realistic way, then the entire project is a no. Projects typically don't go ahead, regardless of whether you're not for profit or not, if they're not profitable on that first element. Now, the other one I talked about is the execution element. Now, that one is the one that's the easiest to massage. Even if if it aligns to your values and it's profitable, but you don't have the ability to execute it, you can partner with someone. You can always call in a consulting firm to help you advise on the matter. That's exactly what they're there for. There are a lot of different ways you can massage that third element, so you don't have to throw the option out. But a big part of delivering the answer is to show that you're thinking about all of these, and then shaping that up to your final answer. And then, of course, once the case is over and you've discussed all the options, you've eliminated things, then just do your usual thing that you do in every case. Play back a good, quick, concise summary of what the answer should be and why. Back it up with one or two, three, no more than three solid reasons of why you think they should be going down that way, and then leave it there. And that's pretty much it. That's essentially all I wanted to say up front about the case. I'm happy to answer any questions. Again, apologies, I don't have a slide and I'm just doing this with words, but hopefully that was helpful.
Vash, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
There's been a couple of times when I've done market entry and driving the case forward, and similar to you, you've got those three criteria. The one criteria that's a no is the profitability one. But I found that a lot of times that after that we drive the case straight away to, okay, well, let's look at ways that we could make it potentially profitable. Whether it be adding, other services or other products to boost it, or do you know what I mean? Like, that's where I would normally drive the case rather than say a no recommendation straight away. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's completely a good point. And a lot of this for me personally as an interviewer, when I've done this, it's very much dependent on how my candidates go, in the sense that if the candidate is really good, which I'm sure you guys are, that means that you will actually get to that profitability answer. You'll be quick with your calcs and you'll actually get to that with sufficient amount of time still left on the case, which means as interviewers, we have the opportunity to now explore your other strategic thinking and your other, your business acumen. So we can actually then follow on with a question. And yes, if you do give us the answer fairly quickly and you're not struggling with that, then absolutely, I'll want to move on and check out your creativity and talk a little bit about, how do we increase the profits and stuff? And that's where you'll then bring in things like maybe the Ansoff matrix, maybe another framework from your MBA or somewhere else, and you can talk about those options.
Thanks, Vash.
Question, Vash, I had was, so just to sort of clarify this framework. So if you've got that open-ended question and it's sort of, company X wants to grow by X amounts, what are you going to do? Then you're looking at that matrix, answer matrix of products and develop product, develop markets. And then you sort of might come up with a few options in that. And then it almost becomes like a bit of a matrix where you've got your alignment, your profitability and your feasibility. So at that stage, you're probably just getting that quick yes, no. And then you might pick one that you drill down into a bit more. And if they were all no's, then probably going to Sam's point, then you'd say, all right, what's one of the better looking ones and how can we make it profitable? Is that your thinking around it?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, one of the challenges here is that obviously this changes from the case to case that you're given. And look, I'm thinking about, I have to remember to do this from two sides. So I have to remember that in my day job, I am a consultant, and sometimes my answer to things is just to my client is to frankly say, no, don't even do this. Like, this is like, in my mind, I'm thinking this is a stupid idea. You're going to regret, you're going to look back on this in 1 year and regret it. Now, that said, I understand that you guys are playing essentially a virtual, a game. That's what a case really is. It's a game. Now, in a game, the situation is not as real world, and it is based on a real world case, but almost always the purpose of the interview is not to just get such a cut, like a cut and dry answer. It's to often see and explore your thinking. So yes, in a case interview, almost always there will be an opportunity for you to ask, what else could we do, or how else could we explore it? It's very rare in a case interview that I would do what I'm doing in my actual job and just tell the client, nah, don't do this. But that's the part where I have to remember that there is a difference between the game, the simulated environment, and the real world.
And I guess
yes,
the thing
you're right.
with the case is there is always going to be an answer that they're sort of wanting you to go down and start exploring. So
yeah, definitely. And look, having been on both ends of this and having worked on engagements which I've then turned into cases myself, sometimes I'll tell you that the truth is that in real world, what we did is actually different to what I have as the story I've written in the case. I mean, part of this is to protect the identity of the client, but part of this is also because the real world version of it is actually not as useful for me to explore a candidate's thinking ability. So I have to often add fictional elements to the case and make it a little bit more open-ended and such that it has a bit more options, so that I can actually test and see their thinking. But that's not actually what happened in the real world. So yes, it is a good point to make. In a case, almost always, if you have knocked out the calcs, and remember, just because I'm saying that if you knock out the calcs fairly quickly, you can get to the next part, don't treat that as a stressor to knock out the calcs quickly, because the worst thing you can do is make a mistake in there, right? Then it shows poor attention to detail. So take the time that you need to, that you're comfortable with. Obviously, you guys would have done, practiced dozens of these before you actually go into a case interview, so you'll be fairly comfortable. But yeah, do take the time you need to feel confident in your numbers, double check them if you need to, give the numbers, and then in the remaining time you're afforded, you don't need that much time on the follow-up qualitative elements. Remember, I'm still talking about interviewee-led cases. I don't have that much experience with interviewer-led cases. I think interviewer-led cases are far more time-boxed, because there is actually a goal that I think the interviewer has, that they have. It's like a 6-part question, and they've got like part 1, part 2, and it's all supposed to be knocked out in 40 minutes or so, right? So you probably are looking at 5 to 6 minutes per part, roughly, over there. So different game.
Vash, I've got a quick one, if I may. And I'm just interested to hear your thoughts as someone who's led interviews, but also being a candidate on the other side of the table. Do you find there, with market entry cases, there are more yes, go ahead, or kind of no, don't proceed? Is it a 50-50 split, or most of the time with the cases, are they generally yes, go ahead?
So this is a really interesting question, Andrew, because the thing is that remember that when you're essentially facing the question as a candidate, you don't actually know what the answer is. Sure. And the truth is that, do not worry, this is something I'm sure other like me who are coming to present have also told you, but pay absolutely no regard or attention. Not that you would know anyway, but literally don't care about what happened actually in the real world. Even if you might have some knowledge about that company, or maybe you can very quickly identify in some cases, if someone says, look, it's a really, if the case starts off as something like, the world's largest mining company, I'm fairly certain that everyone knows who it is. So it's not really that anonymized anymore. But even if you know what happened in the real world, because it was all over the news, completely, my recommendation is to avoid that altogether, because that is only one version of the events that played out, not what could be possible. Attack it with your creativity, with your fullest creativity, and think about, even if, so initially you will always have a yes or a no to the initial question that's asked, because, and you have to have it as a very clear yes or no, guys. Like if the question is a binary option, it says, should I do option A or not? Or if the question says something like, should I take option A, B, or do nothing? Then your answer first and foremost has to be one of those. If you go gray on that, then it tells me as an interviewer that you didn't get the question. But however, you don't have to stop that. And that's the important point. Once you could always say no, but on the other hand, as a consultant, and remember, you are when you're in these interviews, you basically play the role of the consultant. And for all intents and purposes, the interviewer plays the role of the client. So I would love to see a consultant that I'm hiring and paying good money for come in and tell me, you shouldn't do this. However, here's what else I've actually considered that might, something that you may not have thought of or whatever. Like essentially, here's what else I've thought of, like other possible options, ways in which we can actually, whichever one of those three levers can basically be impacted, then yeah, like if it's profitability, it's simple, like that's the stuff where as MBA students, you have tons of levers to pull, from reducing costs to, creative ways to increase revenues to, pushing more volume of product through introducing new product lines, increasing your prices if it's justified, whatever you want to do, right? If it is, if it's something about alignment, your long-term vision and your ethics, well, is there a way in which you can do this that wouldn't be that compromising on ethics? So can you still manufacture can Nike still manufacture shoes in China, but have full traceability of their supply chain to show that they're not using slave labor, and actually demonstrate that to their consumers and to the public and to the buyers? It means they have to pay a little bit more for the manufacturing, but it means that now all of a sudden that one sticking point isn't there anymore. So you should always, and you should, in fact, I'm not just going to say you can, you should, in fact, on top of your answer, always follow up and demonstrate your thinking there.
Okay, thanks, Vash. Oh, just one other question while I have you as
Sure.
well. Is when you were prepping for Deloitte, kind of entering the field, how many hours of case study practice do you think is necessary to really go into this thing confident?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. It's one that I do get quite often. It is very much the how long is a piece of string type thing, right? So there's what I did and then there's what I wish I did. What I actually did was do lots of cases. I think I must have practiced cases for nearly 2 years, but the thing is I never actually did them regularly. So I would do one case every 3 months at the start. So it was literally like I was doing 4 to 5 cases a year. Whenever I caught up with friends for a drink or whatever, we just talk about a case and I'd do it. So it was very infrequent and it wasn't actually building on, like you need good repetition, right, to build your skills. And then definitely once I got the interview, then it was like that intense period where like, or when I knew I was like starting to prep for interviews and stuff, then I did like, yeah, a bit more. So I would basically ramp it up to maybe like 4 a week or something like that. Now, in total, I must have done, I don't know, maybe 40 to 50 cases. But the thing to remember here is that there's 2 elements of this, right? There's the actual, what practicing cases like in consulting club really does is it turns you into, a bit of a machine. It gives you a lot of like just like muscle memory for athletes. You get into a groove where you, even without looking at the watch, kind of feel the time. So you know that, okay, time's, they've given me the case question, go. All right. And then, you take a minute or 2, you prepare everything and you get a very good sense of like executing on time. That's not trivial, by the way. That is important and that's good. But what that doesn't necessarily give you is the creativity in your thinking. Now, the funny thing is that all of you here have done cases, even if you've never done a case in a consulting environment, because every case that you do in your MBA, and I think by the end of your MBS MBA, I think I must have done at least 180 cases or so. Like every class had like, 10 cases at least, right? 8 to 10 cases. So you do the math, like you do a lot of cases. All of those are also cases. It's just that the consulting ones take that 60-page Harvard case and we turn it into like 1 paragraph. But the same elements of complications are there. Like if we wanted to, we could expand it into a much longer write-up. It's just that it takes time. But so you have done cases and you do have a lot of your thinking. Don't underestimate the frameworks you're getting out of your MBA and the creativity you're getting out of your MBA. So definitely apply that. Now, sorry, that was a long answer. Now, the answer to more practically what I think and what I've been recommending to people more recently is I've been giving the number of 12 to 15. I know that seems like a number on the lower end, but here's the big caveat I'll throw in. You have to practice with intent and purpose. And I mean, like, you have to act like, it's like, if you're an athlete, you're training, and then you have your actual matches that you play. But the best athletes treat every training session like an actual match. Like they're out there to win every point and, their minds are on the line. So I don't care if you're doing it in consulting club with just a mate, sitting in a syndicate room. you shut the door and you go in there with like game sight on. That person across the table is not your friend. You haven't met them. Act like they are an interviewer, and that person has to play the role of an interviewer, a hard interviewer, right? Like you, and that's not mean that you have to be a dick, but it does mean that you can't, start handing out answers to the person. I've seen that happen sometimes in some of my consulting club. Like when I've looked at people do cases, I'm like, what are you doing? You just gave that person the answer because you felt bad for them. That's not the point of the case. So you have to go, if you go in and practice with intent and you treat every practice session like a match, then you really don't need more than 12 to 15 to get into that zone. The challenge I see for a lot of people is that it's not about the quantity, it's the intent with which they practice it. Like the first couple, like they're like, okay, this is just like, trial run. I'm just gonna chill out. I'm gonna like relax about it. I assure you, if you were actually interviewing with Deloitte, you wouldn't be doing that. Even if you've never done cases before, you would be going in there because you want to get that job. So you will be going in there with that game face. Now, I don't know how you can manufacture that in a practice environment. I don't have any tips on that, but do whatever you can and practice it with that intent. And then you don't have to do more than 12 to 15. Just make sure that the other caveat is make sure that the 12 to 15 you do are different types. Don't do 12 profitability cases, try and pick cases from different case books, from different companies and whatnot, and go broad. And if you do that, I think after about 12 to 15, you would have probably gotten about, I would say 70 to 80% of the way there. And then after that, you can probably start attempting your interviews. And when you do the interviews, another strategy that others have told me, I didn't do this myself, but I think it's a good idea, is when you're applying, like try and schedule interviews such that everyone's got a list of like most to less desirable companies they want to work for. Attack the less desirable ones first, because if you're going to make any actual mistakes, you'll do them there. And then have the more desirable jobs that you really want at the end. So by the time you've done like 12 to 15 solid practice, you've done a few actual, runs with some companies, and now you're facing the big, the finals, if you will.
Yeah, no, it was, I suppose, just a general comment. I think it was really good to have you here, Vash, just to hear about, I suppose, your experience attacking it, and also, the framework, actually, and how you do it. And obviously, being on both sides of the table, I think it's good to hear your perspective on, what is the ideal outcome being a candidate, and kind of thinking of those extraordinary things about the case that would really capture the interviewer's attention. So, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no worries, Andrew. Sorry, I wasn't able to come to your breakout room. I didn't have time for that one. I did see a few of the other ones. I've got a few general comments I can share. And I'm sure Sam's probably got a couple of feedback points as well from what he's seeing that I can share. Cool. So Ali, what did you want me to just go through my feedback points, and Sam can do the same? Is that?
Yeah, sure. That'll be great. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So these are not specific to any of the breakout rooms I went to. In particular, it's just things I've aggregated from my general observations. But points I would make here is that, so I'll start off with what I think is really good. I like the fact that, at least in the rooms I went to, there was definitely a clear line of logic in what was being asked. So a logic was applied, and in some cases, frameworks were always also used. You don't always have to use a framework you just have to be logical, and you can be logical without using a framework in just a line of questioning and stuff. So I like the fact that there was underlying, good logic on many of these things. The communication style was really good. I thought for the candidates, they were pretty relaxed. And one of the things the challenge here is that it's the candidate's performance is actually very much dependent on the interviewer's performance. And you need experience in also being a good interviewer. And I know that can be a little bit difficult in the consulting club. So sometimes I found the interviewer was also extremely relaxed, and I was like, that's not probably what a real interview would be like. But look, no harm in that. Ultimately, it's a conversation between two people. That's really what the case interview is. It's an intelligent conversation between two people about what they can realistically do between two consultants. So yeah, no harm in that. I thought calcs were really good. Like, there were one or two of the rooms I saw where the calcs, there were some mistakes, or things were off by an order of magnitude. But otherwise, in generally speaking, I think people have practiced their calculations pretty well. That's not bad. Now, things I think could be better. So this is the counterpoint to what I say about the use of logic. Like, it's good that logic is being used, but then there is a difference between what I call robust logic and logic that's like weak. So the most robust logic you can use is always stuff that's based on fact. Now, you might not always be armed with that information, particularly if the case is based in Chile. You don't know anything about Chile, you haven't been there. But what you could do is, and this is something I've mentioned even in the last couple of times I've come to the consulting club, is consider using things like population pyramids. The interviewer can give you the population. If you ask them, like, what's the population of Chile, they can tell you. But if you at least roughly know, okay, this is a developing country, the population, in developing countries, the population pyramid has a narrow base, more or less, a fairly big center, which means that a lot of people are in that younger age bracket of 20 to 40 to 50, particularly by this year, by the year 2020, 21. If you have a bit of that sort of a rough idea, then you get an idea of how to proportion your 20 million across the age brackets, and you have a logic for it. A population pyramid is actually pretty solid. It's something that, and there's only 3 or 4 different shapes of population pyramid that will cover pretty much every country on the planet. Like, if you know these 3 or 4 shapes, and you know if it's a developing country or a third world country or whatever, you can sort of make a fairly educated guess. And that's good logic. Now, another type of logic that some people use, and there's nothing wrong in it, but it should really be your last resort, is basically anecdotal evidence. Anecdotal logic is the easiest to refute for an interviewer. And anecdotal logic is basically saying, well, I think that people are going to do this 80% of the time because me and my mates, we eat fast food 80% of the time. Well, you already know as an interviewer, I can refute that very easily by just saying, well, how similar are you and your friends to the actual population of the country we're looking at here? And if you really are stuck and you have no idea, a better thing to do is to just ask another question, and to actually say, look, what I'd like to do at this point is to go forward and estimate. Now, what I'd normally do, and then ask the interviewer for a question. So ask them, do you have any information about the fast food consumption rate by population, or like by age bracket in this population? Do you have any idea? Do you have any breakdown of the segments in this population and how often they consume various types of fast food? Do you know what the spending power is of various segments? Ask a question and put the pressure back on the interviewer to some extent. Now, the interviewer can simply say, no, I don't. And then that ends that. But at least you've asked the question. And then you're saying, well, in the absence of any other information, I'm going to use an anecdotal data point as the closest estimate I can to move forward. At least now you've given yourself a reason for why you're doing it. And while it still doesn't make the answer any more accurate, at least you've got a reason for why you've gone down that way. Consulting is very much a discussion. It's very much a process of like you're building consensus with the interviewer as you're going along. So that's another point I'd make. And then the last point, which is actually very much along the point of what I just said, is guide the interviewer along by saying what you're doing. So before you once you've been given the case, start off by saying, look, I'd like to get some facts about the company. It's just one sentence, but it makes the process so much clearer. Then you can pepper them with 5 questions. What's this company's product line? Like, how big are they? Like, what's their presence internationally? Blah, blah. But if you just pepper me with 5 questions and I have no idea, like I kind of know why you're asking it, because I've been on both sides of this. So I know you're asking me because you want to get a base, but if you haven't actually told me you're doing that, and remember that this is a scenario. So if the clients you meet might be sophisticated buyers, they might be people who are ex-consultants themselves, but there might also have been people who have never been to business school or even university, right? So there's a wide spectrum of clients we work with. So it's important for us to always be very clear in our communication and what we're doing. Sorry, there's one more last point I'll add before I'll give it to Sam. This was specifically for the case on the pharmaceuticals, which some of you might have done. I know earlier on when I talked about the framework, I talked about like 3 different pillars, but that's not comprehensive. Like sometimes based on the case, I will add other 1 or 2 pillars. So in that particular case on the pharmaceuticals, a pillar that's definitely worth considering when you're dealing with drugs is the question of regulation. And that's not just the regulation of the quality of the drugs, which the TGA and the FDA do, but it's also worth considering whether the price of the drugs is regulated, which means could your profit be capped? Now, the answer here is probably no, because it's the United States, and if you know anything about the US market, the FDA only regulates quality of the drugs, not necessarily the pricing. But it's worth asking that question because your case might not be based in the US or wherever. So the regulation element is something you should consider. It kind of is a sub-element of profitability if you think about it, because it ties into what you can make. The other thing to also consider is, as part of the costs, to calculate the ongoing profits, there are conditions which are like autoimmune disorders, like rheumatoid arthritis, where it's very much produce the drug once and then you can milk it for life kind of situation with minimal R&D. But there are also cases of conditions which are like COVID, what we're experiencing right now, where there's a significant ongoing R&D cost every year to update the vaccine. That's also what happens with flu vax and things like that. So you need to understand that when you're dealing with the drugs, and I know this because I've done a little, I've come from a healthcare background, so I understand this a little bit. But even if you don't, ask the logical question of like, is this the sort of case, like what my ongoing OPEX is going to be to keep this thing front of market and to maintain that market share? Because that might actually reduce your net profit to a much lower number than you think. That's pretty much all the feedback points I had. Hopefully that was helpful. I'll pass it on to Sam.
Thanks, man. I think you covered a lot of the stuff that I wanted to say. And I mean,
sorry for that.
I think you covered a lot of the stuff that I kind of had in my mind as well. I think just to reinforce that logic and the structure, it's really important to kind of talk through your logic before you even start any calculations. It's going to be just a lot more clear and going to help you efficiently kind of work through the maths for it, especially for market sizing. Market sizing is very rare, especially at the MBA level, the single question. So, you don't want to delegate too much time to it. You want to get the maths right, but you don't want to delegate too much time. And it really helps if you have that good structure straight away. And then, you just plug in the numbers. It doesn't look like you're fishing too much. If you haven't got a logic that's well thought out straight away, it comes across as you're just fishing for stuff, and it comes a bit unprofessional almost, and you can lose your structure very, very quickly. Aside from that, no, I didn't really have that much more to add, Vash.
No worries, Sam. I think that was in general. I would say that I thought the quality of the cases attempted, I thought was reasonably good. Like considering for a lot of you, I think it was like your first attempt or like a very early attempt, and I think that's reasonably good. I think definitely, yeah, more practice will get you will get your case ready, and do it with different interviewers and do it with different cases as much as you can. But I think, yeah, credit to the consulting club and for you guys for like organizing this, especially in a virtual environment. Always a pleasure to come and see the consulting club members. And if you guys have any questions about Deloitte, or I'm sure Sam, you're at Kearney, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm staying at Kearney next week, first week.
Oh,
so.
Cool. So yeah, I'm sure you can hit Sam or I up on LinkedIn or whatever and ask us questions about the company and the culture and stuff like that. Otherwise, yeah, nothing more from me.